The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Does God Exist? A second debate between Matt Dillahunty and Blake Giunta.
Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Hutter. I'm the president of the Secular Student Alliance here at UCSD. It's my pleasure to welcome and thank you for attending tonight's debate. To get us started, I have the pleasure of introducing your moderator for the evening, Dr. Rick Grush, has been a faculty member here at UCSD for the last 15 years, researching the philosophy of mind. His education includes a joint doctorate in philosophy and cognitive science, which he earned at this university. He held positions at Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Denmark, and the University of Pittsburgh, before returning to us here at UCSD.
Are you defending the Christian God or
No, just God. Just God.
that's not what it was supposed to be. It's not what it was supposed to be.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce this evening's discussants. First, to my far right, Matt Dillahunty is the public speaker and internet personality and is perhaps best known for hosting the internationally known webcast, The Atheist Experience. Mr. Dillahunty has spoken at atheist and free thought conferences around the country and debated numerous Christian apologists. He also held the title of President of the Atheist Community of Austin from 2006 to 2013. He's also an avid gamer and magician. To my near right, Blake Giunta is the founder of beliefmap.org, an encyclopedic resource aimed to provide users with academically respected points and counterpoints in debates over life's big questions. Mr. Giunta has been studying philosophy and apologetics as an enthusiast for over a decade. He's also co-director of Reasonable Faith Group at University of Texas, Dallas. Blake is a Texas State champion wrestler. But especially enjoys beating people at StarCraft and Halo.
Any players?
StarCraft.
Yeah.
We will begin with Mr. Giunta's 20-minute opening remarks.
Well, good evening. So, does God exist? That is a big question. Matt and I started this conversation in Dallas not long ago, but we didn't have any rebuttal periods. So I know we both had a lot more to say, and I really want to thank the organizers for giving us that opportunity. I am not a public speaker. My claim to fame, if any, is, like the moderator said, a website. I run beliefmap.org, and that's about it. That said, I am really good at making PowerPoint presentations, so that's what I made for you guys, and it's going to help me keep my timing precise. In preparing, I have tried to give a lot of thought to my audience. In the back of my mind, I know three things. The first is that this debate is probably going to be seen by tens of thousands on YouTube over the next few months. The second is that the significant majority of those viewers are Matt Dillahunty fans. And finally, I know that the majority of those fans belong to what's called the New Atheist movement. Now, for those of you who don't know, the New Atheists are generally the kind of atheists that you're going to find at atheist conventions. And a common theme at these conventions is that theism, and by the way, this isn't necessarily Matt's position, but a common theme is that theism is just ridiculous. God belief has been likened to believing in what they call the flying spaghetti monster. So many of these atheists, just like many theists, frankly, feel that they've got a good handle on this debate. And I think this is in part because on YouTube, the same simple arguments seem to show up over and over again. I want to confess that I'm going to perpetuate this a little bit. I'm going to be presenting two simple arguments that get used by Christianity's most popular defender, William Lane Craig. He uses these two in all his God debates, and so they're just all over YouTube. For my own sanity, though, I want everyone to know that there is so much more out there to sink your teeth into if you're up for the challenge. Philosophy of religion is what we call the branch of philosophy where professional philosophers specialize and publish on this debate topic. And to illustrate its vibrancy and depth, I want to briefly recount my time at a philosophy of religion conference I attended a few months ago at Baylor University. And it started with me first seeing Alex Pruss, who is a professor there at Baylor. This is probably his most famous argument for God's existence, but few know it because it's too heady for many and hard to present on YouTube. More recently, he has been doing work with Professor Josh Rasmussen at Azusa Pacific. Rasmussen was also at this conference, and like Pruss, he has published multiple arguments for God's existence, with whole academic books and peer-reviewed papers being written in response. This one, in 2011, has received the most attention and is probably my third favorite argument for God's existence, the modal argument from beginnings. Well, now, Pruss and Rasmussen are working together on a book which covers in depth 4 new arguments for the existence of a necessary being. One is a new version of Rasmussen's 2011 argument, but with even more modest premises. A second argument is this argument from Abstracta, and another is this Gödelian argument from Perfections. Rob Coons was also at the conference. He teaches nearby at the University of Texas at Austin, where Matt lives. And among the arguments Coons has published is this sophisticated proof for an absolute beginning. Just last year, though, he published a new argument for the same conclusion, and in it he focuses, like Craig, on the impossibility of past events numbering to infinity. But he uses a new proof. This is Coons' new kalam, and there is no question that it's a better argument. But this is also one of the hardest papers I've ever read, and there's just no way to present it at a debate. Another professor there at Baylor is Trent Doherty. He published a book last year attempting to address the problem of animal suffering, which is, by the way, one of the hottest arguments against theism in the philosophy of religion today. In it, he introduces a new argument, which he calls the likelihood argument for theism from evil. He's also currently editing a book titled 24 or so Arguments for God's Existence, forthcoming by Oxford University Press. That is around 24 arguments from over 24 professors. And speaking of Oxford, 2 Oxford professors were also in attendance. One presented his own argument from consciousness, and the other presented his argument from contingency. Several more arguments were presented, but perhaps my favorite argument at this conference that you can and just need to watch on YouTube is Professor Robin Collins' presentation on the discoverability of the universe. You can just Google his name with the word Baylor and you'll find it. Collins is both a physicist and philosopher who's been working on a 2-volume book on the fine-tuning of physics argument for God. Well, now some new discoveries are so exciting that he's put the whole project on hold so that he and his research team can pursue this new discoverability argument, and it's got a lot of people excited. There is a lot more to discuss, but the final paper presented at the conference was from Professor Ted Poston at the University of Southern Alabama. He presented the argument from so many arguments, and this is also a brand new argument, very technical, and obviously it was just the perfect way to finish the conference. The story that I want you to see here is that there is a lot to dive into outside of what's on YouTube or what you'll hear tonight. I also want you to know that theism is doing really well in academia right now. Quentin Smith is an atheist professor at Western Michigan University. He's well respected. He publishes arguments for the truth of atheism, and he's also debated William Lane Craig a couple times himself. Things have gotten so challenging for Smith that he feels, that not long ago he published the following, quote, "There are now over 5 philosophy journals devoted to theism or the philosophy of religion, overflowing with submissions from leading philosophers. If each naturalist who does not specialize in philosophy of religion were locked in a room with theists who do specialize in philosophy of religion, and if the ensuing debates were refereed by a naturalist who had specialization in the philosophy of religion, the naturalist referee, wanting to be a fair and objective referee, would have to conclude that the theists definitely had the upper hand in every single argument or debate. God is not dead in academia. He returned to life and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments." So that's all I have to say on this. The point here is not that you should take it on authority that God exists. There are authorities on both sides. The point just is that if the academic world of argumentation is new to you, then I hope that you would find this material intriguing enough to want to investigate further and maybe hold off on thinking that theism is just ridiculous until you've had a chance to look at some of the more academic stuff. I think you're going to find yourself richly rewarded. So let's take a look at 2 of these more simple arguments from William Lane Craig. The first is the Kalam cosmological argument. One of those questions that we've all asked ourselves is, Why is there a universe? Atheists have typically insisted that physical reality has always been uncaused and eternally existing. But there are good reasons now, both philosophical and scientific, to think that the universe, in fact, came into being a finite time ago. We've alluded to one strategy earlier used by both Craig and Coons, which notes that an eternal past requires that an actual infinity of past events have been traversed. The issue is, there are several ways to show that such infinities are impossible to instantiate in the real world. It leads to both metaphysical absurdities and contradictions. For example, scenarios arise where you can take away equal quantities from equal quantities and arrive at contradictory answers. Consequently, as David Hilbert and many others have observed, infinities can have mathematical utility in axiomatized set theory, but still, quote, the role of an infinity is purely that of an idea. This means that the past number of events cannot actually number to infinity. The past is finite, and so we must face an absolute beginning. What about the evidence from science? Many atheists had insisted that the notion of a beginning to physical reality was simply unscientific. As confessed by Lawrence Krauss, our favorite atheist, a beginning, quote, was not even remotely expected, end quote. He speaks in the past tense because, unfortunately for those atheists, cosmology had a different story to tell. It turns out that the whole universe, in fact, originated about 14 billion years ago in an event we've all come to know as the Big Bang. The need for a beginning has been further solidified by the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which is so modest in its assumptions that its conclusion holds regardless of how you describe the earliest phase of the universe before Planck time. It can also hold, despite completely different physics within a multiverse. Vilenkin writes, quote, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." Also consider the second law of thermodynamics. The universe is obviously not in a state of heat death. Things are still winding down. And this matters because if the universe were past infinite, then entropy would have already run its full course. But it hasn't. So a beginning is just a finite distance away. This beginning to the universe continues to fascinate thinkers because it seems to represent the origin of physical reality from literally nothing. One way Craig has articulated his kalam then is as follows. 1. If the universe or multiverse began to exist, then the universe has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, let's think about the candidate causers here. Since the beginning marks the introduction of space, time, and matter, the cause must be able to exist independently of space, time, and matter. That's very specific. Moreover, the cause must also possess both the disposition and ability to cause of all things an entire universe. This is a cause that sounds, in my opinion, too suspiciously like the God that philosophers and theologians were positing long before the discovery, the God that people all across the world have testified to experiencing and knowing. The argument is not, we don't know what caused the universe, therefore God did it. Rather, in formal terms, the argument is this: the universe's being caused to exist is evidence for theism over atheism because it fits better and is more expected on the hypothesis of theism. Next, consider the fine-tuning argument. This is yet another indicator that the cause is God. Craig introduces the argument this way, quote, "In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the initial conditions of the Big Bang were fine-tuned for the existence of life with a precision and delicacy that literally defied human comprehension. This fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. These constants are not determined by the laws of nature. These laws are consistent with a wide range of values for these constants. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy or the balance between matter and antimatter in the universe. End quote. That was all from Craig. But this isn't just Craig saying this. In Nature magazine, Brumfield authored a piece titled, quote, "Our Universe, Outrageous Fortune," and he confesses, "If you believe the equations of the world's leading cosmologists, the probability that the universe would turn out this way, life permitting, by chance are infinitesimal." Luke Barnes recently published a review of the scientific literature on this topic, 200 plus papers, and says that he only knows a handful of physicists that oppose this conclusion of fine-tuning and piles that support it. Here you see some of the constants that are widely recognized to require fine-tuning, and here is Craig's argument. The fine-tuning of physics is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. It's not due to physical necessity or chance, therefore it's due to design. We know it's not due to physical necessity because, as we said earlier, the laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values for these constants. For example, the cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, which is a lot of ways that it could have been different. If you get it wrong, by the way, the universe either expands so rapidly that you only ever get the 2 lightest elements, or it collapses within picoseconds of the Big Bang. In either circumstance, though, no life, obviously, of any kind could evolve. So, in hopes of salvaging the chance option, some atheists are seeking a successful multiverse model with enough variation that they can say at least one was bound to get lucky by chance, and we are one of those lucky ones. This has several devastating problems, though. Multiverse models face the measure problem and the Boltzmann-Brains problem, both of which I can elaborate on if Matt wants to bring them up in the debate. Moreover, the models all face unique problems at the physics level, so if Matt wants to propose a multiverse solution, I am going to ask which one. Finally, the most popular versions, like inflationary superstring models, tend to require fine-tuning themselves, just pushing the tuning they wanted to rid themselves of into a new area like the proverbial ruck in the carpet. For these reasons, the multiverse models do not seem to be a helpful way to deal with the fine-tuning argument as an atheist. Physicist Philip Ball writes, quote, "Our universe is so unlikely that we must be missing something. The incomprehensibility of our situation even drives Susskind's team to ponder whether an unknown agent intervened in the evolution of the universe for reasons of its own." David Deutsch at Oxford University says, quote, "If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he is hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely." Design, then, really seems to be the best explanation. Once again, we have yet more information which is far more probable and more expected on the hypothesis of theism than the hypothesis of atheism. Wrapping up, I want you to remember that the title of the debate tonight is not "Has God's existence been demonstrated?" Just like it's not "Has God's non-existence been demonstrated?" The debate is very specifically, does God exist? The competition is between a pro and a con. Now, maybe one position is the rational default, or maybe agnosticism is. I'm incidentally convinced that theism is the rational default, and here's why. Studies show that humans are innately inclined to find theism commonsensical or intuitive. By intuitive here, we mean that cognitively healthy humans from childhood into adulthood are innately predisposed to think atheism seems false or even absurd. Several studies show this. Consider this Oxford study published in 2011. Quote, "A 3-year international research project directed by 2 academics at the University of Oxford finds that humans have natural tendencies to believe in gods and an afterlife. The £1.9 million project involved 57 researchers who conducted over 40 separate studies in 20 countries representing a diverse range of cultures. The studies, both analytical and empirical, conclude that humans are predisposed to believe in gods and an afterlife. A 2011 Harvard study demonstrated that people with a more intuitive thinking style have a stronger presupposition in favor of theism. A 2013 Boston study concluded that even scientists give theistic design type answers when forced to respond, atheistic scientists, when forced to respond under time pressures. And finally, a 2013 Finland study demonstrated that atheists find theism intuitive, quote, exhibiting evidence of emotional arousal when they dare God to cause harm to themselves and their intimates. They would perspirate. According to the CIA.gov's World Factbook, only 2.1% of the world population is atheist. And this is why. Not only is theism intuitive, but atheism is deeply counterintuitive to individuals first considering it. It is kind of like solipsism, a view which only shows up in the university and holds that you are the only mind that exists. Everyone else and everything else is just a figment of your imagination. This is your dream world, and there is nothing to wake up to. Atheists say that God does not exist. Solipsists say an external world does not exist. They are very similar in the relevant ways. So let me conclude with this final argument. 1. If belief in God is instinctive for humans, it is defeasibly reliable. This means that the natural, intuitive belief can be overturned. But prior to sifting through the evidence and being overturned, the intuitive belief is justified or rational for the cognizer. 2. Belief in theism and belief in an external world are both instinctive for humans. 3. Therefore, belief in theism and in an external world are both defeasibly reliable. 4. Therefore, belief in theism is defeasibly reliable. This is why I believe theism is the rational default belief, and in conjunction with the two evidences for theism I provided, I think we can at least have a good starter case for God's existence. Thank you.
Next we'll hear Mr. Dillahunty's 20-minute opening remarks.
Sorry, let me grab this.
Hi. So thanks for having me here. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very grateful to Blake, who stepped in because somebody else was originally supposed to debate me on a completely different topic. And I prepared for a completely different debate anyway, because I was going to address, the specifics of the Christian God. But this debate on whether or not God exists has been done, well, let's say to death, over hundreds, if not thousands of years, depending on how seriously people took it at different points. There's been no, hey, it's time to take the trash out. Honey, if you're watching the stream, remember to take this trash out. There's been no real progress that I can see. And the 10 years that I've been hosting the Atheist Experience TV show, I've seen a number of trends which, upon investigation, seem to reflect other trends, which is a bunch of people believe something and they set out to prove it logically. Not by finding evidence to support the idea, not by any sort of investigation that we would normally use to figure out whether or not something's believable or true, but through a logical argument. And so then they have arguments back and forth, and people poke holes in those arguments. You know, somebody might present the original version of a cosmological argument where, hey, everything has a cause for its existence. And then that leads to, oh, well, what's the cause for God? We need to find a way to exclude God from those things that have a cause. And so we'll just say everything that begins to exist, and God didn't begin to exist, now he doesn't need a cause, haha. And this tradition of repackaging, polishing off the old arguments, bringing them back out again, I don't want it to dismiss it, because the reality is we appear to be stuck in our ability to investigate the supernatural, which is to say we can't. We're blocked. There's a reason why science relies on methodological naturalism and doesn't make pronouncements, it doesn't make pronouncements about truth anyway, but it certainly doesn't make pronouncements about the supernatural. So when we're investigating these sorts of things, we're left with nothing more than intellectual exercises. And that doesn't mean that you can't get to good, reasonable grounds about things, but by and large, the whole God question is an exception to all the rules. It's an exception where all the other mechanisms by which you would determine what is rational, what is reasonable to believe, just don't work. Now, there are people who think that their God has the sort of characteristics where he manifests in reality, or it manifests in reality in some detectable way. And when those sorts of things come up, we can try to put it to the test. And the history of that has been abysmal, because every time we try to put these sorts of manifestations to the test, they don't perform any better than chance, and sometimes worse. You can look up a Templeton Foundation, or I guess it's Templeton Foundation, study on intercessory prayer, where, hey, we're going to have a whole bunch of people with cardiac illness, and people are going to pray for them. We're going to have this group that's not being prayed for, this group that's being prayed for and doesn't know it, and this group that's being prayed for and knows it. And guess what? None of them did any better, and the people who knew they were being prayed for did worse. It's like, not only did God not bother to answer any prayers, but specifically decided to give those people performance anxiety who knew they were being prayed for. On the issue of what the default position is, this is a point where Blake and I are definitely in pretty violent disagreement. Because I don't see how you can argue that the default position is that something that you have no evidence for and haven't experienced exists. Should the default position on Bigfoot be that he exists until he's proven not to exist? The Loch Ness Monster, fairies, ghosts, goblins? But what about all those other gods that don't happen to be the gods that fit into the one that Blake wants to accept or that somebody else wants to accept? Wouldn't that put us in the position of being forced to say, yep, all of these, I'm going to say it's rational to believe that all of these exist until they're proved wrong, because now you're in a position where you are forced, if you're going to remain intellectually honest, to believe contradictory, mutually exclusive, competing ideas about gods. There's a reason why in the courtroom you're not expected to prove your innocence. Because sometimes some propositions, some claims are unfalsifiable. There's no way for you to actually demonstrate that this didn't happen. And so in a courtroom, we expect the prosecution, who's making the claim that you are guilty, to make the case. And if they don't, then the jury is to vote not guilty. The jury doesn't vote innocent. So yes, the question of the title head is, does God exist? And you could say, it's a question, so Blake must be arguing for yes and I must be arguing for no. Well, if the title of the debate were, does Bigfoot exist? Then the people who would be arguing, yes, Bigfoot exists, the only opposition to that is, no, Bigfoot doesn't exist? Well, I don't think so, because that puts us in the guilty and innocent categories, instead of the guilty and not guilty. And so the question, I'm not going to complain about it, because we'll just go ahead and address it, is phrased wrong. Do we have a good reason to believe that God exists? Yes or no? No. That one I'll answer no to. I appreciate the yes. I do. And Blake would have said yes too. But I'm happy to say no on that one. I'm not making, and Blake and I still haven't had the chance to have this conversation, maybe we will later, who knows, about whether or not atheists are in a position where they assert that no God exists. Because that's not the way I use the word, that's not the way even American atheists use the word, that's not the way most atheists that I interact with. By the way, there's no such thing as new atheists. If you talk to the atheists who are being labeled new atheists, they're going to say, yeah, we don't call ourselves that. We don't. This is kind of an outside label that somebody else has applied, because guess what? In the last decade or so, I don't know, partly because of the internet, maybe because 9/11, maybe because people are able to have conversations more, religion's on the decline and non-believers are on the rise. Hooray! But we're still a tiny minority, and there's still lots of arguments, so I have job security. So I was actually going to segue into the specifics of the Christian God, but since it turns out we're just going to defend a generic idea of God, I'll just point out that, and this is not a slight against Blake, by the way, because I think under other circumstances we would actually discuss this, but we've been having these debates forever, seemingly, at least a couple thousand years with regard to Christianity. And I have yet to have an opponent really even attempt to defend Christianity. Nothing about specific doctrines, although there's been tempting, we could maybe argue the resurrection, but that just never quite seems to happen. We can argue general things about morality. And when I was a Christian for more than 25 years, 1 Peter 3:15 commands me to be ready at all times to give the reason for the faith that I hold. And yet, whenever I get into a debate, it's always this generic concept of God. Now, that's not a fault with the arguments. That's not a fault with Blake. But I think it does betray an actual problem. There are over 1,000 different denominations that identify as Christian of some type or another. And that's just one religious label. There are Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Scientologists. Let's exclude them for a minute because we're really not sure what they think about God. Because then I'm not going to pay enough money to get to like the operating thetan level that allows me to hear about Xenu. But there are countless religious ideas. But even if you start to narrow it down, I was a Southern Baptist for 25 years in a church that was well, I wasn't in the same church the whole time, but part of the Southern Baptist Convention. I can tell you right now, and most of the believers in the room would probably agree, that despite the fact that that church has a set of doctrines, individuals in the church don't necessarily agree with all those. And if we drill down even further, we might find that there's a different packaged God concept for every single person on every single pew, which is why you have disagreements in the church, which is how you end up with a new denomination that splits off from the old one. And you just basically hang with the people whose views are most like yours about God. Because, as far as I can tell, we don't have any way to find out which one of those is actually true. It's beyond our ability to investigate. If it were the case, if we did live in a universe where there was a God who wanted a relationship with us, which is the offering of Christianity, you'd think it'd be kind of obvious. We know what it's like to have a relationship with people. From my own experience and from what I've seen from other believers, their relationship is kind of like, yeah, I've got a girlfriend, she goes to another school and you don't know her. Because there's not ever any offering of any tangible, real evidence. There's no consistency of belief. There's no consistency of effectiveness of prayer or doctrine. There's not even agreement on these points. For years, I was told, well, just reach out and God will reveal himself to you. I did. Oh, it's your fault. It didn't happen. Okay. Every time we get into those sorts of conversations, and I realize I'm way off on a tangent here that has nothing to do with what you said, because this is my opening statement.
Yeah,
so we're good. But every time we do that, we end up saying, oh, well, we just agree to disagree, and we run off and have a different doctrine, or we get to a point where we say something really kind of strange, and that is, it's a mystery. We can't know the ways of God. We can't know the mind of God. So there's a question here. Either a God exists or it doesn't. Those are the only two options. If it doesn't exist, we're done. Because we can't possibly, well, we shouldn't have a good rational reason to believe in a God that actually doesn't exist. I won't say it's impossible. But if a God does exist, then there's two further options. Either it manifests in reality in some detectable way, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, its existence is now indistinguishable from our perspective from its non-existence. It's where we get the line that the invisible and the non-existent look pretty much the same. It's a little bit glib, it's a little bit funny, but it's real. Because if something doesn't actually manifest in reality in an indetectable way, then it is indistinguishable from our frame of reference from something that doesn't exist. Which means in order for us to have any kind of productive conversation about whether or not there's a God, that God must in fact manifest in reality in some detectable way. That's awesome. I like that. And by the way, we know that must be the case because believers are running around claiming to be little God detectors. Oh, I have a personal relationship. I really feel God's moving in my life. God's leading me this way. I know that God did this. God grew a limb, even though we don't have any evidence for that happening. God cured me of this disease or sent it into remission, even though that happens all the time without any need to appeal to the supernatural. And so we have people making claims about manifestations of events that are purportedly supernatural in origin. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, science seems to be blocked from investigating the supernatural and confirming supernatural causation. How do you confirm supernatural causation? At best, you can just run out of natural explanations and then go, oh, I can't think of anything else, but we already know that's a fallacy. Just because you've run out of explanations that you can come up with naturalistically doesn't mean that you get to jump to a supernatural explanation ever. And the supernatural doesn't explain anything. The God hypothesis doesn't explain anything. They have no explanatory power because we explain things in terms of other things that we know. And in the case of saying, hey, there must be a cause for the beginning of the universe, we'll just say it's God. Now you're trying to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery. You're trying to solve an unknown by appealing to a potentially, if not actually, bigger unknown. something you know even less about. And so you've got people claiming that they're little God detectors, and if they're detecting an undetectable God, well, that's already flawed. If you can detect the undetectable, well, all right, now we've got a whole new field that we need to study about how you've been able to detect the undetectable. There's, as far as I can tell, no physical evidence to support the idea that any vague, generalized deistic or theistic God actually exists. As someone who's been in the atheist, agnostic, skeptic, secular community for, well, I've been hosting the TV show for about 10 years, so a little bit longer than that. I am often emailed by deists. And there's theism as the top level position, some God exists. And deism has a specific idea that there is a God that exists that started it all but doesn't intervene in anything, doesn't interact in reality in any way. And my question to everybody who comes up to me from the deist community is, how did you detect this God that you don't think interacts in reality in any way? Well, I didn't. I just, the universe needed some explanation, and so I went ahead and accepted this idea that there must be some being who started it all, but clearly he's not interacting with us in any way, so that's how I got to deism. Then there's pantheism and panentheism, the idea that either God is the universe or the universe is God or everything is God and all this. These are all attempts to find something that you can attach a label to, because guess what? We live in a world where we have all been indoctrinated with this idea. It's hardly surprising that we tend toward theistic notions if you're raised around people who are constantly making appeals to theistic notions. But the pathway that they go through to try to demonstrate that their God exists either doesn't do that at all, as I'll point out in my rebuttal to the Kalam cosmological argument, or it goes about it by making appeals to special ways of knowing, either revelation or faith, or some undefined, undescribed new way of knowing. See, if you're going to go about things and investigate in a scientific method, you have an observation, you try to come up with an explanation for those, you might come up with a harebrained hypothesis, and you need to test it out, and you need to make sure that your hypothesis is actually falsifiable, and then you gather evidence, and then you put it into beakers. No, actually, you don't always put it into a beaker. There's no one scientific method, but the process of critical thinking that examines the evidence is what we use to figure out whether or not our understanding of the universe is correct or likely correct. And I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. I like it so much I put it on a t-shirt. It's my formulation of kind of Hume's view on epistemology. When we're talking about God, you start with, I believe there's a God, so there must be evidence to support this. I mean, this is the type of thinking that I had as a believer. My God was obvious. When I have callers go into the show and say, just look at the trees, and people laugh, that's the way I thought. All you had to do was look at the trees. It's obvious. There's just no way that this magnificent universe could have come into existence if it weren't for the idea that there's a God. It's a compelling thought, in part because it allows you to stop worrying about it. As soon as you accept this answer, you stop looking for one. And if everybody does that, then, well, okay, we'll just all accept that this is real, whether it is or not. The problem with accepting answers like those, though, is that it keeps you from finding out what the real answers are. I had somebody call into the show once and say, if God didn't create the universe, who did? Now, under modern apologists' arguments for a generic sort of God, well, they're actually talking about the same thing, so it would always be God. But why shouldn't the question be, what is the explanation for the origin of the universe? Because that question allows you to answer it with, a God did it, or some other explanation. The problem is, the argument that a God did it always seems to come down to, it just seems like a God is the best answer for that. And the last time Blake and I had this debate and discussed things, I brought up this example of if I were dealing cards at a poker table and I dealt you all 13 spades. That's more likely to happen when I'm cheating or doing a magic trick than when I'm playing honestly. But if I deal you all those, does that mean you're reasonable to rational to conclude that I cheated? Are you even, and if you are you willing to bet your life on it? Are you willing to make an accusation that this is, oh, yeah, you cheated, there's just no way? Well, we know that it's not true, that there's no way that this could happen. So really what you're saying is that because something seems implausible or seems unlikely, and I have this explanation which is consistent with and is potentially a cause, well, then I'll just go with that. The thing is, wouldn't you need to know whether or not your potential explanation for the cause is even possible? To talk about something living, existing, a thinking agent existing outside of space and time, I have no idea what that means, and I definitely don't have any reason to think that it's possible. And so they begin with God and desperately try to lead all of the evidence towards their conclusion. And that's the opposite of critical thinking. It's the opposite of science. It's the opposite of how we go about figuring out anything. Instead, we follow the evidence towards whatever the conclusion is, no matter how unlikely it is. It's the surprises in science that help us learn and grow. If instead we just decided we knew and package everything to fit what we think we know, we'd get nowhere. And every time that somebody has extended their doctrine to the point where they make claims about what their God can or can't do, or has or hasn't done, and we've been able to investigate to determine what the actual cause is, not once have we confirmed that it's a God. Not once. That's a hell of a trend. Which will be easy because I didn't say anything.
So you'll recall in my opening statement that I made 3 arguments for God's existence. I presented the cosmological argument, that the universe began to exist and ultimately had a cause, and that the best explanation is God. I presented the fine-tuning argument for God's existence, and then I also made the case that we have a sort of evidence from intuition and reason to think that God is or theism is the rational default belief. In Matt's opening statement for God's non-existence, which is what the debate is, he presented 2 arguments. One, it seems is this argument that I guess God doesn't manifest in reality, and so therefore God doesn't exist. His other argument, I guess, was this divine hiddenness argument, which is, hey, if God exists and he loves us, why doesn't he make his existence more clear? I've got to say, this is going to be a little difficult because Matt didn't actually lay out any specific premises. And philosophers make people lay out premises and conclusions because that's what allows us to test to see if an argument is good. Otherwise, you're going to get a bunch of hidden assumptions. And I can try to construct this, but I don't want to put myself in a scenario where Matt just comes back and says, I didn't mean that. So I'm going to do my best here. First, he said that the arguments for theism just don't work. I hope I don't need to say that this is just question begging and we can ignore it. He said there's no progress in the case for theism, but I felt like he shouldn't have said that given my opening statement. And in a sense, this also begs the question. He says that theism hasn't been demonstrated. But first, again, this is the philosopher in me. What does he mean by demonstrated? I mean, in some very important senses, I think theism has been demonstrated. And if he disagrees, this again is begging the question. Now, I incidentally think that Matt means something a little more specific than that, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment, and he can correct him if I'm wrong. But again, this is something that he needs to be clearer on. He says that theists basically believe in God first, and then they go find the evidence for it. This is called poisoning the well. This is not an argument either. So there's not a lot to address just yet. He said that atheism is is just a lack of belief. In our first discussion, It was at the Bible and Beer Consortium, and that's fine. I don't correct people in a lot of settings because I'll let them use the terms as they want. But in an academic setting, I know one professor's invited a lot of his students to come listen to this. If you say that atheism is the lack of belief on your test, you're going to get the answer wrong. That is not how it is defined in academia. For instance, the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy says, atheism denotes the belief that there is no God. This use has become the standard one. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, 2011, says atheism means the negation of theism, the denial of the existence of God. The Oxford Companion to Philosophy says that atheism is the doctrine that there is no God, or the doctrine that the Christian God does not exist. The Blackwell Dictionary of Western Philosophy says the belief that God, especially a personal, omniscient, omnipotent, benevolent God, does not exist. The Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy says the same thing, and it's written by a really prominent atheist, William Rowe. He says, as commonly understood, atheism is the position that reaffirms the non-existence of God. And if we tried to redefine it as simply a lack of belief, which, by the way, it doesn't tell you whether you're an atheist or an agnostic, it just ambiguates the term so you don't have to defend what you believe. But if we did actually do that, it would require a complete rewrite of all the academic literature out there on this topic. So again, I think that it's important to point that out just because of the setting of this discussion. So let's go back to Matt's claim that theism hasn't been demonstrated. What does he mean by that? This ultimately, I think, is grounded in his claim that God belief is unjustified. And you have to understand, in Matt's view, in order for something to be justified, you've got to be able to demonstrate its possibility. Remember, you heard that. And he also wants to say it's got to be verifiable by some reliable method. I've got thoughts on both of those, but let me back up and say that I think there are a number of severe problems with Matt's approach to beliefs, and he developed this himself. The first is that it's not going to let you know, and we talked about this in our previous discussion. If you go to heaven, okay, and let's say you get judged and you come out, a sinner. Suppose Christian is true. Just understand the concept. Suppose Christianity is true. You go to heaven. You're condemned. You go to hell. Okay, outer darkness, and you're there for a long time, and you go here after experiencing all the eschatological events of the book of Revelation. You are in a situation, according to Matt, where you still can't verify that you are in hell. You still can't justifiably believe that God exists. What he says is that you can have pragmatic reasons for accepting it, the same way you have pragmatic reasons for thinking that an external world exists. But it's not a justified or verified belief. And so that's one pretty big problem. He says, another challenge is that, well, I won't go into that one just yet. There are several things that I kind of want to point to that we can know, but that on Matt's system we're not going to be able to know. But I'm going to go ahead and let him flesh out his views a little bit more before I do that. He says that we should take the position of these jurors, right? And I want you to notice that jurors will agree to judge a man innocent even when they know that he's probably guilty. And Matt wants to apply this to God, meaning that if the case for theism is stronger, unless it's overwhelming, you should still agree to judge God innocent of existing, just because that's what we do for suspects, for pragmatic reasons. In other words, I think Matt's saying he wants a handicap. I say don't give it to him. It's irrational. You do not need beyond reasonable doubt evidence to believe the man is guilty, nor believe that God exists. The jurors can believe the man is guilty and still judge that he's not guilty. So again, okay, let's look at this claim of his that we need to be able to demonstrate possibility. So we can demonstrate possibility several ways in philosophy. The first way is going to usually be done in some kind of way of conceiving of something's possibility. You understand how it works, and through that you can see a scenario in which the event or circumstances actualized. So that's one way to argue for possibility, and I think we can do that for God's existence. There's certainly no incoherence, at least nothing that's been presented on Matt's account. And what about causal explanation? I guess that's how Matt framed it in terms of supernatural explanation. How can that even be possible? Well, I mean, it fits just fine on all the known accounts of causation that I've come across. I mean, it fits on the making things happen accounts. It works on counterfactual accounts of causation, manipulationist accounts. I'm just going to need to see an argument here. I don't know why we should accept this claim that we need to demonstrate possibility. And as we continue to think about that, I mean, has Matt demonstrated that it's even possible for the Bible to have an error? I mean, I know other books can have an error, but can he demonstrate that the Bible has an error? Right? And if he tries to show me an error, I guess what I can do is I can just say, well, I know you're trying to show me an error, but before you can show me one, you need to demonstrate that it's even possible. Right? How would you respond to that? Or like, let's say you're a scientist. I don't think scientists use this criterion, and you're wanting to establish universal common ancestry. That's one big event, universal common ancestry. You can run the same thing. How do you know it's even possible that universal common ancestry is true? That seems like a pretty big challenge. What about, how do you know it's even possible that Jesus did not rise from the dead? I mean, I know other people can fail to rise from the dead, but when did you demonstrate that it's possible that Jesus didn't rise from the dead? Again, I just don't think this is a good criterion. It's gonna leave a lot of true beliefs out of it if you go with that path. He says we need to be able to verify whatever we believe by a reliable method. Again, I'm just going to need him to flesh this out and explain what exactly that is and what he's talking about. Let's turn now to the argument from hiddenness. It's interesting to me that recently Matt has been saying that he does not want to use the problem of evil because it's too easy for the Christian to come back and point out, or the theist in general, to come back and point out that you don't have the information you need in order to make that judgment call. Well, this is susceptible to the exact same kind of challenge. If you're familiar with the butterfly effect, it's kind of hard. The idea is one small change in the world has radical effects all throughout. So, for instance, just because you exist and the way you influence the world, countless hundreds, thousands, or millions of mothers will conceive 1 second later or 1 second earlier, leading to entirely different persons being born. And those persons in turn are each going to cause hundreds of millions to conceive 1 second later or 1 second earlier. And again, this is the butterfly effect. Changes to the smallest things can affect so much. And so my question is, in light of this, how can Matt know whether God has reasons for not revealing himself to particular persons? Would these individuals love God if he did reveal himself to them? Would they continue to love God throughout their life? Maybe would giving them what they need somehow cause others to reject God's love later, so that on the whole there are fewer people in relationship with God? In addition to considering how this affects relationships with God across history, what other goods are lost in the process? In order to run this argument, again, we need something more clear. Right? Where is Matt's calculation for concluding that this results on the whole in a worse state of affairs? Again, this is just one of those scenarios where we're going to need more clarity. So that's really all I think I need to address. But I've got, I guess, 5 more minutes here, so I'm going to see if I can maybe preempt some of Matt's arguments. I guess, okay, so here's something I can do in order to sort of get ready for maybe cross-exam, just an idea of what I'm planning on doing. I think that I can take sort of Matt's methods of discerning what justified beliefs are, and I can use his very particular way, his very particular skepticism, to dogmatically defend biblical inerrancy. I alluded to this just a little bit before, but I want to flesh it out here. So the idea is we can employ what's called methodological biblical inerrancy, and this is supposed to be juxtaposed with what's called methodological naturalism. And in the sciences, this is the idea that we never want to propose supernatural explanations in the science. Why? Because the whole job of the scientist is to find answers in terms of laws acting on initial conditions. That's what the science is about, finding your initial conditions and laws that act on it. So basically, even if something is best explained by a God or a miracle, I do not want my scientist trying to provide a supernatural explanation. His job is trying to find the best naturalistic explanation. And What we do from there is we take that best naturalistic explanation up to the philosophy department. And their job is to look at that and ask, is the best naturalistic explanation the best explanation overall? So that's methodological naturalism. But Matt wants to not do that second step. His idea of if you want to be rational, you stick with the first step. And so I've sort of devised this analog is you can also have methodological biblical inerrancy. And the idea is that we should only look for answers that are consistent with the Bible being inerrant. And this can be a fruitful hermeneutic even for non-believers, because what that will force you to do is to try to find an answer, and that could be useful for individuals later who would come up and say, okay, but is the best answer that preserves inerrancy the best answer overall? Is it actually averting an error? So if you can do this sort of methodological protection mechanism for your view, then I'm going to go ahead and employ it for biblical inerrancy. Okay, and so then I can say, how can you even demonstrate that it's possible for the Bible to have an error? And really, I think that's all that I have here. So I guess we're just going to invite Matt back. I want to see some clear arguments. We saw two. I think I addressed both of them. His other one was about... I did address that. How did you verify it? Yeah, I think that's really all I've got. So I'm going to invite Matt back up. He's going to give us some more clear arguments. I'm hoping that we can really sink our teeth into, and then we can have some fun with those. Thank you.
Mr. Dillahunty? 15 minutes.
All right, I apologize if I end up talking fast because there's a ton to get to in 15 minutes. The label I use and how I define it is entirely up to me. Words don't have definitions intrinsically, they have usages, and I guess if the argument is that we'll have to rewrite all those academic books to be more consistent with the way people use the term, then rewrite them. I'm fine with that. On the response to the problem of evil and how I prefer divine hiddenness, it's not that I don't want to use the problem of evil, it's just that I know that to people that I've spoken to, there are sects of Christians in particular for whom the problem of evil has no impact. Calvinists really don't get bugged by it. There are others for whom it's incredibly useful. A lot of people I've met who have deconverted entirely because of the problem of evil. That was set aside. So getting to Blake's opening remarks, here's a bunch of arguments from really smart folks at big universities, and he's not making an appeal to an authority by any stretch of the imagination, but it's there to add weight, and that's important. I agree with him that there's an area of study here that is valuable, and there are a lot of people, including a lot of really brilliant theists, who are offering great information on it. There are some problems, though. First of all, I won't go through the entire Kalam cosmological argument piece by piece, but I'll offer a couple of quick notes. Whether or not time had a beginning is something that has been both proposed and rejected by Hawking Penrose, both proposed it and then later rejected it. So this idea of whether or not the universe began or had a beginning, or what that means or what that means temporally within the realm of possibilities of multiverses, basically, once we get to a point, we don't know. And the nice thing is that there's a lot of people who are willing to say, hey, we don't know. And there are some people who are just unwilling to say we don't know, and instead they want to say that they do know. So if you follow the Kalam cosmological argument through, even if it was entirely valid and sound, where do you end up? The universe had to have a cause. That's it. It doesn't tell you anything at all about the cause. It doesn't tell you that the cause needed to be an intelligent agent. It doesn't tell you anything about the cause having to be all-powerful. It doesn't tell you that the cause had to be something that was entirely consistent with classical theism or modern Christianity or anything else. It doesn't even tell you if the cause had to continue existing after it created. It's basically, at the end of the day, hey, this started, something must have done it, God. And you heard Blake say it himself, that it sounds too suspiciously like the God that people had been proposing. Well, that's hardly surprising because people have been looking for a way to explain things. Hey, where did the universe come from? Some being who was capable of producing the universe did it. And then when we find out, hey, there had to be some cause that was capable of producing it. Well, that sounds suspiciously like the God that we invented to act as an explanation for this. This is what we've done throughout history, is tried to stick God into the gaps in our knowledge, and then as we find out the real answers, those gaps get tinier, and some of the gods who aren't malleable, who can't be distilled into a generic argument for the existence of God, those gods go away. With regard to the Borguth-Lincoln model, I highly recommend that everyone go watch Sean Carroll's debate with William Lane Craig, because here's the deal, I'm not a physicist. I don't know shit about it. Sean Carroll is, though. William Lane Craig, not so much. And there was actually a rather embarrassing moment in that debate where Sean Carroll had a video of Dr. Guth holding up a little sign that basically says Craig doesn't know what he's talking about when he's referencing my model to support his view of God. But I'll leave that for you to explore on your own. This idea that something might sound too suspiciously like a God is also tied up in some things that he said later on about how we are intuitively inclined towards theism. Well, what's that mean? That means that when we have a question or when we experience something, we get this feeling, and the propositions that we've become familiar with about theism seem to fill the gap. Now, evolutionary biologists would explain this in different terms, that we are agents who attempt to recognize agency, and that we are the product of generations who, when they saw something rustling in the bush, the ones that ran away because they thought it might be something out to get them, even when it wasn't, were more likely to reproduce and care for their young and carry on the species, whereas the ones who went, hey, what's that? Or who just said, nope, nothing in that bush, they were more likely to die. But it's natural for us to reach those kind of conclusions because we live our lives by inference and deduction. We learn how to understand the world based on what we've already experienced. And if every other time something has happened, it's been because she did it, or he did it, then when I see a bigger version of this or some other, kind of conundrum, of course it's intuitive to suspect agency. We're trained to do that. But that doesn't mean that the tuning for suspecting agency comes from a God. There's been a lot of talk about the God module in your brain, how you're tuned for God. Well, even if that were the case, that doesn't mean that there was a God who put a module in our brain to tune us to suspect God. That doesn't even make any sense in the first place, because if there's a God who wants a relationship with you, he doesn't need to put a module in your brain to make you kind of suspicious that maybe there's a God. He can just talk to you. The problem of divine hiddenness that I presented is not as easy to respond to as the problem of evil, and the difference is this. When you start to say things like God might have reasons for not revealing, that is already in contradiction with the claim that God wants a relationship. So the reason the problem of evil isn't particularly compelling in many cases is because you don't have absolute knowledge about everything in the universe. You don't know how much, maybe this is the best possible world, maybe it's not, maybe there's some good reason for this suffering over here. You can dance around that stuff all day long, but when you tell me you're talking about somebody who wants a relationship with me, guess what? I know what it's like to have a relationship with somebody. I'm an expert in having a relationship with me, and that's why the problem of divine hiddenness is vastly different from the problem of evil. Well, maybe God's got really good reasons for why he doesn't have that kind of relationship with you. Maybe he does. But then we don't have that relationship, and he's the one that's precluding it because I'm here. Show up. The water's fine. As far as this idea for the possibility, I don't know how we got to biblical inerrancy, which is really weird, since the order of creation's wrong. The earth was not. The earth didn't exist before the sun. I mean, we don't just know that from the way we've discovered how planets are created from accretion disks, but also from dating, and all of science would have to be thrown out for the earth to be all of physics. Yeah, everything's derived from that anyway. All of science would have to be thrown out in order for the earth to actually be older than the sun. There was a statement where he was anticipating a response related to a multiverse, and specifically pointed out that he was going to ask which multiverse. Well, I don't know. I don't even know if there is a multiverse. I'm not a physicist. Can't even say it. The thing is, let's say I was a physicist who had a good understanding of the multiverse and was offering this as one of many possible explanations, because again, science doesn't make proclamations about truth. It creates models that are the best explanations for the universe that represent probabilistic, tentative conclusions about what we experience. It doesn't matter which multiverse. It doesn't matter at all. And it doesn't matter if we didn't even have that explanation, because the God explanation doesn't become right in the absence of some other explanation. So whether I know which multiverse model or not is irrelevant. Whether anybody knows or not is irrelevant as to whether or not somebody's made the case for God existing. On the fine-tuning argument, I think it was Hawking who pointed out that if the universe is fine-tuned for anything, it's for the creation of black holes. I find it incredibly funny in retrospect. I understand it's compelling that we're so focused on a life-permitting universe. And what we really mean by that is a me-permitting universe, because we're arrogant. The universe is all about me. We live in this universe. Isn't it awesome that this universe came into existence just so I could come into existence? That's so improbable. But if you change some of those things, as Vic Stenger and others pointed out, you might end up with an entirely different universe with some other life which may eventually become intelligent who would be thinking exactly the same thought. Oh, but it's all so improbable. Okay, maybe it is. Doesn't mean you get to propose an explanation that just because it might correlate or just because it might be sufficient, that doesn't make it a necessary cause. And it certainly doesn't mean you've come to the conclusion about the right cause. These are all arguments from incredulity. When we get to the end of the Kalam cosmological argument, hey, that sounds kind of godlike, and I can't think of anything better, and none of these atheists have proposed anything else. That's the big problem. That's why Blake continues. Sorry, I forgot your name. Hi, Blake. It's one of the reasons why, and I've been wanting to have this conversation. I wanted to have it before this debate because he keeps saying atheists are those who propose it or assert that no God exists. Now, I'll be happy to assert that I don't believe in a God, and I'll be happy to claim that I'm pretty confident that there actually aren't any gods for a number of reasons, not the least of which, I love that at the end of his talk when he talked about the argument from so many arguments. To me, the argument from so many arguments is for atheism. The fact that people who run around believing that they've got a personal relationship with the risen Savior, that they are the children of a loving God who has some divine plan and some place for them to go, sit around coming up with argument after argument after argument after argument instead of producing the corpse, or the lack of a corpse, the actual living entity. The reason I say produce a corpse is because he asked how I would determine that it was possible for the Bible to be errant, or how I could claim that the Bible wasn't inerrant without first demonstrating that it's possible. And that's the thing, when I talk about you would first have to demonstrate that your conclusion or that your proposition is possible before you can actually have a good reason to believe in it. I'm talking about things that exist in the metaphysical realm. He wants scientists to come up with naturalistic explanations and then turn it all over to philosophers to run with to come up with the rest. Well, that's fun, but I'm not convinced that it gets us to anything real. Now, if you want to be able to demonstrate the possibility, then showing a single error, like the mistaken order of creation, both demonstrates that it is and that it's possible. That's why we try to produce the corpse. That's why if you have somebody that's on trial for something, see, in this case, if you were to compare the case for God with the trial, he even said juries are willing to rule someone innocent. That's not what they do. It's not guilty. It is a presumption of innocence, and that's where we've established what the default position is for the burden of proof. And we establish the default position on a broad-based claim by determining essentially the null hypothesis. And by definition, the null hypothesis is something that cannot be provable. It is the unfalsifiable proposition. And so, I lost my stopwatch. 2 minutes. I'm glad, so towards the end of his opening, there were also some things about philosophical possibilities and modal logic. And last time we had this debate, we had the Bayes theorem modal logic argument. It was a teleological argument that was towards a moral arena. And I was really, really hoping we get to talk about that again. But my position is not, there are no gods. That's not the thing that I would assert, and certainly not with absolute certainty. My position is I have no good reason to believe that there are gods. And when I get in arguments and debates with people who claim that they do have good reasons, I remain unconvinced. I'm not saying that I'm correct, but by and large, they're talking about a God that is not just, oh, I created the universe and ran away. Because if you want me to say I believe in that God, I don't know why we would call it a God, but I'm okay with the possibility that there's something that started the universe off. But I don't know what the justification is for calling it God. There's a lot of baggage in the God label that gets ignored when we have philosophical discussions that only trend toward deism or not even classical theism, just raw theism, that there is something, first cause, etc. But that's not the God that people believe in. And that's not the God that we're having conversations about when atheists who don't believe in that God are working for church-state separation and working to end religious privilege in the United States and other areas. I'm not faulting Blake. I still want to talk eventually about the God that is causing so many problems, because the deistic God who kicked off the universe and went away, to the extent that he might exist, doesn't seem to be doing anything that I care about, that we should be debating or discussing. My eternal soul doesn't depend on it in any way, and that's not where the problems with religious privilege and church-state separation come from, and so it's completely outside the realm of my interest, even if the philosophers want to run with it. And by completely, that's hyperbole. Of course, I care a little bit.
Okay, I just want to clarify the structure of this discussion a little bit. Each discussant is getting and has had 20-minute opening remarks. We just finished 15-minute rebuttal. Following this, each will be given a 12-minute cross-exam and then 8-minute closing remarks. For the cross-examination, 12-minute cross-examination phase we're at now, we're going to be switching the order, which means that Mr. Dillahunty is going to go twice in a row. So you now have 12 minutes for your cross-examination.
Okay. You guys hear me? Yeah. I hadn't actually talked out of this mic yet. So first of all, I have to actually apologize to Blake, because I was under the impression that we were going to be talking about the Christian God. He wasn't. That's not his fault. It's probably mine, as my schedule has been crazy. But we can certainly talk about the proposition that a God exists. And I guess the first question is, it's going to sound mean after what I just said, but I'm getting to something. What argument did you present that couldn't also have been presented by a Mormon or a Muslim or a Hindu or a deist or a general theist?
Well, a Mormon couldn't present it because Mormons believe that there are an infinite regress of these smaller deities. In fact, they believe that we can become one of these deities ourselves. So they don't believe in a beginning.
So how did you rule out their model?
Well, your question was about my argument.
Yeah, I told you I was getting somewhere.
Oh, is this a new question?
Yeah.
Okay. How do I rule out their argument? Well, I think I just gave an argument against an infinite past that wasn't responded to, by the way.
Okay. Sure. Yeah,
I mean, do you have any objections to my arguments against an infinite past?
I don't know anything about. So there's this is my question time.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. We'll come back to that.
That's pretty sneaky. No, and I'm fine doing this, as you know, more conversationally. Yeah. I don't know. So much in the way that Hawking Penrose said, oh, time began with the universe, and then said, oh, maybe it didn't. My answer is I don't know. And while I understand that there are certainly philosophical issues with the potential of an infinite regress, I don't know that necessarily gets us. See, when we talk about the beginning of the universe, we're talking about the beginning of our local representation of the universe. We don't know what came before it, or even if what came before it is a sensible question to ask, whether or not there was anything before it, whether time, we just don't know that, or at least I don't know that. So I can't really say. So I think it's probably best if we talk about this issue of possibility and probability, because I am stuck, so far as I can tell, dealing with reality, and I operate scientifically to the best of my ability. I analyze things. I try to find supporting evidence. So within the bounds of reality, It seems to me that the proper default position, now this may change when we move outside the scope of reality, but within reality it seems to me the proper default is that something doesn't exist until there's a good reason to think that it does. That the burden of proof or the demonstration of existence is on the claim of existence and not on non-existence.
So I think that there are a number of things that we can rationally believe. So do you believe, going back to my opening statement, that there is an external world? Do you believe that that's rational?
So my acceptance of the external world is entirely practical. I can't demonstrate it. I mean, so this is the idea of solipsism. You could all be figments of my imagination. I don't believe that that's the case, primarily because I think it would be absolutely arrogant to think that I came up with all the brilliant things those scientists came up with that I don't understand. And I think it's also potentially self-defeating that at one point I didn't understand something, and at this point I do, to the extent that I understand anything. And so whoever taught me that, if they were a figment of my imagination, that would have been me teaching me, and I don't, it seems rather schizophrenic.
Yeah,
kind of
it
thinking.
is schizophrenic.
And so as a matter of practical reality, I'm fine with accepting that this is real and that there's an external world until such time as somebody demonstrates that there's not.
So just to clarify though, you don't think that it is rational in the epistemic sense. You're saying that there's a pragmatic reason, I'm going to go ahead and accept it, but it's not rational in the truth-seeking sense.
It's also the case that I experienced this.
Well,
I'm stuck. I can't do anything other than with what I experience.
when you say I experienced this, you're talking about just the experiences in general, which is exactly what the solipsist said. So you can't use your experience to discriminate between solipsism and external world realism.
I don't have a solution to hard solipsism.
Okay, I just wanted to be very clear about that.
Yep.
And the idea is that belief that in an external world is also not verified. It doesn't meet your criterion. It is not rational to believe. It's just something we just accept. Is that right?
So the entirety, you're talking about scopes, basically. I began with, I'm going to accept this reality and the rules that are apparently in there. And it's from that point on, now we're talking about within the scope of this reality. As I experience things and investigate them, it operates by rules, and what we're looking for then is consistency and,
I understand you assume it. My point is that you made a number of claims about what's rational to believe, and you were talking about demonstration and all these
Right.
other things, but there are several things that you believe that you can't demonstrate. In fact, the very principle that you have to demonstrate something like that itself is not something that you can demonstrate.
Yes, so when I had this debate with Saiten Bergenkate, about when we get down to the laws of thought, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, I'm fine with the idea that there's no way to rationally demonstrate those, but once you're inside the scope of that, now you're doing it with respect to those.
Real quick. Sorry, this is well beyond the laws of thought even. This is a principle that that is not part of the laws of thought. The principle is in order for something to be rationally believed, in order for something to be rationally believed, it has to be demonstrated. That itself is a principle which has not been demonstrated. That's not part of the laws of thought even.
No, that's within the scope of the reality that I experience. If there were some other reality, it might have different rules. I'm just talking about rationality within the scope of this.
You can't experience a proposition like that. That is a unique proposition that you believe that very few other people believe, and you've just accepted it. You're just saying it's a starting belief. That's what you're saying, right?
The starting belief is that, well, I experience a reality. The starting belief is that this, as a matter of practicality, this reality is real.
But the reality you experience is not the following. The proposition that in order for something to be rationally or justifiably believed, it has to be demonstrated. That is not part of something that you can experience. That's something you've added to your experiences.
I'm talking that applies within. It's post that. I begin by accepting reality, and within that reality, within those experiences, there is a definition or a categorization of rationality of what is it that I'm experiencing? Is this real? Because we know that within this reality there are also delusions, there are also errors in thinking. And so within reality we use scientific investigation, critical thinking with respect, all founded upon the rules of thought and the nature of the reality that we purportedly experience.
Okay, next question.
I have
thoughts about that, but I want to address more of what you're saying.
That's all right.
I can respond to that if you want.
No. So the last time we had this conversation, your idea was that everything's possible until it's proven impossible. I don't want to bring up old stuff if that's not what you still think, but I
have a small exception, but yeah, very very loosely. That I would accept that. With the one like really technical philosophical
Well, what's the
Do you want me to give you the exception?
in really small doses?
Sorry, say the principle that you said I affirmed again.
Everything's possible until it's demonstrated impossible.
Epistemically possible. In other words, everything, if you cannot demonstrate an incoherence in some proposition, then that is evidence, is what I said. That is evidence that the proposition in question is possibly true.
So you're fine with the idea that there are multiple mutually exclusive concepts that are possible?
That are epistemically possible.
Yeah, well, okay.
And one cognizer,
sure,
would be highly irrational if he was holding multiple of those at the same time.
So right now, if my friend Aaron is watching, he's throwing things at the monitor, and it's not your fault. It's as much mine as anything. He's pointed out, and I agree with him on many occasions, that whenever we have these sorts of conversations that are supposed to be about God, instead of actually talking about the existence of God or providing evidence, we get into conversations about what's real, what's not real, what can you rationally believe, right down to the foundations of thought, which we both agree on. And so we both agree that the laws of identity, non-contradiction, exclude-middle we're working with those.
Right, and so here's my response to what you were saying earlier. I agree that we should work with those. My point is that it seems to me that you've put forward a principle that something is not rational to believe unless it's been demonstrated. And my point simply is that these starting points of thought have not been demonstrated. And so the principle that you've been employing is false.
No, because the principle applies post that.
Well, that's just another way of saying that it doesn't apply there and it's failed.
It can't apply there.
Well, you can't demonstrate those first principles.
Right. Can you?
No, that's the point.
Okay.
Is you?
Okay, so we're in agreement.
Let's clarify.
We're in agreement that you can't demonstrate.
Just to clarify, something must be demonstrated unless it's one of the first principles. That's what you're saying. Okay. Very good. That's what we needed. That's all.
Well, see, curiously, Blake and I do this. This is the exact point that I was getting to. You're just phrasing it differently. So we agree on the logical absolutes, as Matt Slick would call them, even though that's not really what they're called. And we agree that I think we would agree that we not only experience a reality, but a shared reality. Mm-hmm. So you and I are in the same reality so far as we can tell. Right. Good.
Yeah. So far, so good. Man, agreement.
So within the bounds of those, as we go about and we explore reality, are there manifestations of this God that you're arguing for in reality?
I think that there have been many manifestations. I mean, I'm a Christian, and I have reasons for thinking, for instance, that God has manifested himself in Jesus. And in Israel's history, I think God has manifested himself in creation.
So the question is, how would you go about demonstrating the things that you think are manifestations of God?
Well, just like I did in my opening statement. I'd give arguments, and I'd employ...
Well, you gave an argument for the Kalam cosmological argument, which I don't think ties to manifestations of God in reality, because you're talking about like the creation of reality, the reality we experience.
Well, an effect of the cause. And so how do you define
this is all post-cause.
How do you define a manifestation? We better start with there.
Well, I just asked you for examples, and you went to Jesus.
Okay.
Not the beginning of the universe. So for something like, you think that God manifested in reality as Jesus, you weren't specific about that. You just went to Jesus.
So by manifesting, can you be clear what you mean by manifesting?
Okay, within the reality we experience, there are things that happen, events that we can observe and detect and investigate. Those, I would say, are manifestations. So far as I can tell, every time we've been able to find out what the cause of a manifestation was, it was natural. And you're purporting that there are manifestations of the supernatural. Okay, and when I asked for manifestations, you went to Jesus.
In my case, I think that there are several... This is another way of asking for evidences.
Yes.
And I think that what I presented in my opening statement were evidences.
Okay, so we're in stark disagreement on what should count as evidences, which I think we knew. Outside of the origin of the universe,
okay,
which doesn't get you to God or Christianity, The Kalam cosmological argument doesn't end with anything other than
Well, I mean,
there must be a cause. Even Craig adds additional arguments to show how he gets to Christianity.
Right, so under the Kalam heading, you're right, its premise, the third premise is therefore the universe has a cause. Then I added the second part, which goes on to explain why the best explanation, the best candidate cause,
Right.
is this hypothesis that was already in existence, and it's the best candidate, it's the best explanation. That's abductive reasoning.
Sure. Wait, did we just run out of the 12 minutes on me?
Yeah, now
Cool.
of course you guys are being kind of conversational, but now would be officially in your 12 minutes. of
Oh, okay.
All right.
So,
We'll get back to that.
Yes.
Because I don't have to actually answer what he asks. I can just do something else.
Just like sing, do your magic tricks. Going back to my arguments,
Do I get to ask you 2 questions during yours like you did during
if you
mine?
can slip them in really craftily, because I did a good job of that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's quite all right. So you mentioned this model, this Hawking model. Are you talking about Hawking's no boundary model?
I don't know.
My guess is, because this is what gets brought up in that discussion, is you're talking about Hawking's no boundary proposal. And it has...
My only contention is that, to the best of my understanding,
Okay, that's fine.
there is not agreement on whether or not time started. Now, that could have changed since the last time I read something, but I don't know.
So in the Hawking model, there is no beginning point in the universe, but it still has a beginning. Now, going to the claim about the consensus of scientists...
Yeah, I was only talking about time.
Time, yeah.
Not-
Well, the universe, the Big Bang, is the introduction, supposedly, of space, time, and matter. It's all coming into being.
So
Out
that
of
is the
nothing.
thing.
Right, so
I can't cite it,
that's
so
what
I'll have to
Hawking-
send you an article later.
Right, that has a beginning on the no boundary proposal. So,
Okay.
and if you're talking about the consensus, I don't know what the consensus is. To my understanding, the consensus would sooner lead towards thinking that there's a beginning because of the
I
Borg-Guth-Lincoln
have
theorem.
no problem with the idea that there's a beginning.
Because of the second law of thermodynamics. I don't know if you have any reservation. That argument that I gave. I think the Big Bang currently, as we know it, is the most elegant explanation, and really the reason that people try to push it backwards is because, as I noted, a lot of naturalists feel like it is not scientific almost to have a beginning, because in their mind, if there's a beginning to all the natural stuff, then the question arises, well, what caused that? And it's not going to be natural at that point. And so, yes, they're looking very hard for something else, but that's not where the evidence is currently pointing.
Well, that's where in your opening you mentioned it was unfortunate for those atheists that there was a beginning.
Right.
And I would say that it wasn't unfortunate for them at all. Or the part that was unfortunate had nothing to do with their atheism, because we haven't concluded that a beginning necessitates a God or any God that anybody's proposing.
Okay. And remind me, what was your worry about the fine-tuning argument?
What was my worry about it?
Yeah.
So, Vixinger and others have pointed out that if you twiddle with the configuration of the universe, it's not necessarily impossible that you might come up with a different universe that would produce a completely different life. We're biased towards us, and we're biased towards our type of life. But even if that were the case, even if that weren't the case, and this was the only universe that was capable of producing any life ever, that still doesn't get us to the why. See, the fact of a thing, or the unlikelihood of the fact of a thing, does not tell you what the explanation is. The explanation is something that needs to be demonstrated.
Right.
And the only demonstration I see is, hey, I've got a proposed super being who's capable of being the explanation. And I'm not trying to be glib about it. That's what my brain hears every time this comes up.
Yeah, so we have the hypothesis of theism and the hypothesis of atheism, and because I'm used to it, just grant me the usage that I'm dealing with.
Or
just
you could
'cause
say
that's how my mind works.
naturalism, whatever.
And now we come across this new observation that the universe is permitting life. And we know from the evidence that I provided in my opening statement that the likelihood of the universe being life permitting is incredibly low.
But the likelihood of me dealing you 13 spades is incredibly
Let me
low.
finish the argument. You're right, because it needs two parts.
Okay.
The first part is just how improbable it is. On atheism, the likelihood of the universe being life permitting is 1 over some insanely large number.
Okay.
On theism, the likelihood of the universe being life permitting is not low, because creating a world which allows for moral agents to interact with each other, that permits their existence, is very much the kind of thing that God would do. So you can pick your number, but it's not going to be anywhere near as low as it is on atheism. And here's the conclusion. Just by definition of evidence, when you have a piece of data, like the life permittingness of the universe, that is far more probable on one hypothesis, in this case theism, than another hypothesis, atheism, just by definition of evidence, that observation counts as evidence for hypothesis 1, theism, over hypothesis 2, atheism. That's just how it works.
Sure, and if I'll go back to the cards again, because I don't know any other easy way to explain it. If I deal out all 52 cards to 4 people and you end up with 13 spades, on the hypothesis that I cheated, that's very likely. On the hypothesis that I didn't cheat, that's incredibly unlikely. 1 in, 500 million or something like that.
Isn't it still evidence that you cheated if that happened?
It is an indication that this is consistent with cheating, but it isn't evidence for the proposition that I cheated, or it isn't sufficient evidence to conclude that I cheated, or even to conclude how likely it is that I cheated.
So
the action that I took or didn't take is independent from what the odds of the hand are. This is why when we talk about...
Real quick,
Sure.
real quick. You're right that you cannot conclude that you're cheating, the dealer is cheating. But that is irrelevant. The question is whether it's evidence. And in formal terms, yes, you do have evidence that he cheated, that the dealer cheated. It's not proof.
So in colloquial terms, if we were to say, I have evidence that he cheated, what people tend to take away from that is you have evidence that would compel someone to believe that in fact this person cheated.
That's not true.
Simply saying you have a data point that is consistent with somebody cheating is not the way we normally say I have evidence that he cheated.
No, I think people are aware that you can have evidence for and against a true proposition. I think they're okay with that.
Okay. We'll let them decide later.
You talked about theism, and when I talked about theism being the default based on intuitiveness.
Yeah.
This is interesting. So you brought up the hyperactive. By the way, how much time do we have?
About 5 months.
Okay, good. Okay, so you mentioned this hyperactive agency detection device. I just wanted to throw an interesting study at you that was put out by the University of British Columbia in 2014, so just recently here. And I'm going to read the quote. I know you're not going to have like a prepared thought on it, but the idea is quote, anthropomorphism operationalized as the tendency to project human-like attributes to non-human entities was not related to belief in God in our model. In our adult sample, it was not related to belief in God even in a zero-order correlation. This may be surprising given theories that argue that anthropomorphism and hyperactive agency detection are not underlying features of all supernatural belief. Given influential theories that place the origin of religious belief in anthropomorphism, it was surprising that the path from anthropomorphism to belief in God was non-significant. I don't know if that is on my website. I don't know.
So I don't know what the study is or what it was about. I'd have to read through that and figure out what exactly they're talking about. But when I talk about anthropomorphism with regard to evolutionary origins, I'm speaking generally, but you also would consider the fact that by and large most people are raised in a society where predominantly people do this, no matter what the reason is, they would do this, so it's hardly surprising that the offspring of people who do this would continue to do it.
Okay. And let's go to the hiddenness argument now.
But my point is that doing this is clearly, I think everybody would agree, we do this. The question is why? Well, if the proposition is the reason we do this is because we're right, this sort of thinking has been programmed into us by a God, and this is
No, that's not what's going on. Okay, so in the hiddenness argument, so what did you think about my question? Sort of, where did Matt get this calculation? Is how I put it. Can you remind me how you were responding to that?
To which calculation?
Well,
I don't recall
for instance,
doing any calculations. I'm not good at calculations.
Yeah. So here's a question. How do you know, for instance, that that the individuals who haven't, for instance, received a revelation of God or haven't been convinced aren't individuals who will maybe later in life come to accept, or alternatively would be, I mentioned, the kind of individual who, for just through that butterfly effect, would ultimately result in more people not coming into a relationship with God? It seems like...
How do I know?
Yeah.
How do I know that? Okay, so first of all, I'm not pretending to... first of all, I'm not convinced that anybody who's claimed to have this revelation has actually had it. But for the people who haven't, how do I know that them having it won't eventually result in fewer people having it?
Fewer people being in a relationship with God. The whole argument behind the hiddenness deal is that God would reveal himself to more people. And
So
the reason being because
if God wants a relationship with somebody, is there anything I could do to stop it?
No.
Then there's my answer.
Well,
If God reveals himself to somebody, then we can definitely know, you just asserted, that there's nothing that I can do that would stop somebody else from believing in God. So God can clearly reveal himself to me without somebody else further down the line not being able to get that revelation, because God can do or not do as he chooses as far as revelation.
Wait, so we're talking about God revealing himself to you?
Well,
or are we talking about...
we can use it as a single example.
Let's back up. Let's restate this argument. The argument is that, look, God is a loving God, and in his love, he would want to make sure that everybody has the necessary prerequisites to enter into a relationship with him. This is how Schellenberg, who's the main proponent of this argument, puts it.
Okay.
So God would make sure that everybody believes so that they have what they need in order to enter a relationship with him if he wanted.
But if God is making sure that everybody has what they need to enter into a relationship with him, then why don't people have a relationship?
I'm restating the argument right now just so you understand what I'm going after. Now the question becomes for Schellenberg, or Matt, if this is how you're presenting the argument, in order to say that this is a problem for theism, what you have to do is demonstrate that the way things are being done right now does not result in more people entering into a relationship in the future. And I said that's really hard to do because of the butterfly effect.
But I just did because of your answer. So let's say that there's, just to make the math simple, this is the entirety of the universe.
Okay.
And God can have a relationship with anybody in this room if he wants to. And there's absolutely nothing I can do to prevent it.
Nothing
right?
you can do to prevent it, right? They can prevent it. Any one
Sure.
of them can refuse to enter into a relationship.
Okay. So they can all thwart God if they want to? If God wants a relationship with them and they don't want it?
Well, yeah, I think the relationship is something that's freely entered into. That's the nature of the relationship.
Okay, but I mean, it takes two to tango, I would assume.
Yep.
Okay. So if I want a relationship with God, and we're in this room, and God decides, no, I'm not going to reveal myself to him because that would stop somebody else in the room from having a relationship, that makes no sense. Because
or two or three or
two or
more.
three or whatever, yeah. So that makes no sense because let's say that this front two rows here are the potential who wouldn't. If God reveals himself to me and to everybody else in the room and all the rest of us are willing to do it, then all of these people would then be able to witness this relationship. They would still be able to make a decision, evidently, as to whether or not they wanted to enter one. But how could my having a relationship with God be a hindrance to them instead of a help?
Well, suppose that...
I mean, if a relationship with God's a good thing...
Suppose that you entered into a relationship and you set a really bad example as a witness for someone who is in a relationship with God, and as a result of that, this individual over here maybe gets harmed by you and rejects God
won't make me a Christian because there's a likelihood I might be a terrible one.
I'm just giving you an example.
That's the summation.
Yeah, but the point is that you can't know how things are going to play out and what relationship costs are going to come as a result of God hiding or revealing.
Yeah.
And if you can't do that, then a premise of the argument just doesn't stand.
Except that in that scenario, I'm in a position where I want a relationship with God, and God doesn't want a relationship with me because of consequences.
Yeah.
So there's a scenario where God doesn't want a relationship with me, which contradicts your idea that God wants a relationship with everybody.
You can
God only wants a relationship with the people
this is like,
if it's not going to cause a problem with a relationship with other people.
Did you want to get out of bed this morning?
I don't know, but I mean, it sounds like we're starting to talk about the world's wildest polycule.
Well, I'm guessing there was a sense in which you wanted to get out of bed and a sense in which you didn't want to get out of bed. You wanted to stay in bed, but you chose to get out of bed because of these other reasons over here. God can have the same thing. God can have both of the desires, and he can choose one.
But you said God wants a relationship with everybody.
Yeah.
And then your argument is God wants a relationship with everybody unless...
No, he can still he can still have that desire. The point is, is that he can still choose not to
So,
enter
so
into
God's
a
full of
relationship.
unfulfilled desires.
I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think God desires a relationship with you, and that's unfulfilled. I have no problem with saying that. I don't know.
I know it's unfulfilled,
Yeah.
but I think we're on time.
Okay.
Okay.
Wait.
We're about to transition to the last stage, which will be the closing remarks. First up for the 8-minute closing remarks would be Mr. Giunta.
I think it should be Matt, if I'm correct. Oh no, that's right. It is me.
Whatever.
Either way.
I don't have a closing.
Yeah, I do. I wrote my closing, at least part of it. So let's see if we can think about sort of what we've covered in this debate, some of the contours, and I don't know if we'll be able to reach any conclusions, but the debate title is Does God Exist? And I think I presented 3 arguments for this. In reflecting on Matt's objections, I don't think he objected to the second premise of the argument that the universe began to exist. I guess he raised a worry about, nope, I don't even remember that. I apologize. Yeah, that I didn't address in cross-exam. Yep, I don't remember that. What about the fine-tuning argument? Here, I think we, in cross-exam, established that we have a situation where the universe, if we tweaked the laws of physics or the initial conditions to even the finest degrees, then the universe would be completely incapable of supporting life. The way I framed this argument was that on the hypothesis of atheism, this is extremely improbable. It's improbable as 1 over the number of ways that the universe could have been different that won't permit life. What you're comparing that probability to is the probability on theism that the universe would be life permitting. And when you compare these 2 numbers, the number on theism, the likelihood of a life permitting universe on theism, is far greater than the likelihood of a life permitting universe on atheism. And in basic Bayesian evidential terms, this is all it takes in order to establish that you have a piece of data that's evidence for one hypothesis over the other. And so in this case, it seems to me like we have evidence for God's existence. In cross-exam, I don't think we had a response to that. So I think the fine-tuning argument stands. It doesn't have to be a conclusion that God exists, but it's definitely very strong evidence. In fact, the degree of evidence is the degree to which it's more expected on the first hypothesis as opposed to the second. So that's the fine-tuning argument, the Kalam argument. What about this intuition point that theism is the rational default? What did Matt say about that? I think he brought up the hyperactive agency detection device. I responded to that. There's a study that shows that this is not, the God belief is not caused by whatever inclinations to over-detect agency in nature would be. So that is also, as far as I can tell, standing. Matt did raise the divine hiddenness argument, but I think we saw in cross-exam that this is going to require an extremely sophisticated calculation that I don't think Matt's going to be able to perform. And so I don't think that that's very compelling. And other than that, he just wanted to say that God belief was unjustified. But that is actually not an evidence against God's existence. And as we dive into Matt's reasons for thinking it's unjustified, it turns out that a lot of things are unjustified that you'd want to say are justified, like we mentioned solipsism, or other things like inductive reasoning, the reliability of inferring from past instances an extrapolative inference to future, the way the future behavior will be. So in light of that, I don't think we should accept Matt's criterion for discerning whether something has been demonstrated or that something is justified. And another criterion of his was that something must be demonstrated to be possible. I think that there are several things that he can't have demonstrated. Well, that didn't make any sense. I think I have like 4 minutes left, so I'm just going to read what I have at the end here, if you don't mind. So I talked almost an hour tonight, but in my final 3 or 4 minutes, I want to tell you why I think this debate is significant. It's because of the new beliefs that it can lead into. So remember, Quentin Smith was talking about how theism is doing really well in academic philosophy of religion today. Well, he goes on to say that, in particular, it's Christian theism that's doing well because these theists are mostly all Christians. This is not true of more narrow disciplines where whole worldviews are not evaluated. If you look to science, for example, there's a very strong Islamic presence today. But in philosophy of religion, Muslims are nearly absent. I think this is because of the lack of evidence for Islam and arguments against it. There are also virtually no Buddhists or Wiccans either. It's Christians. Here's another interesting fact. Although most philosophers of religion are not biblical inerrantists, many are regularly finding the secular historical case for Jesus' resurrection compelling. Let me list for you 4 well-known philosophy of religion professors who've researched this topic extensively and published their material with a prestigious press. 1, Timothy McGrew at Western Michigan University. 2, Stephen T. Davis at Claremont McKenna College. 3, Richard Swinburne at Oxford University. And 4, Gary Habermas at Liberty University. And by the way, Gary is both a philosopher and a historian. He publishes in both fields. Well, he is now finishing up a 2-volume academic book on this topic, and he's probably the world's leading expert currently. Now, I know many will be skeptical that a decent secular historical case can be made for a miraculous event that occurred 2,000 years ago and is only recorded by Christian sources. But a surplus of skeptics with exactly these complaints have, upon investigation, come out being convinced or very surprised at how difficult the case is to dismiss. Gary Habermas was one of these skeptics. He used to be an agnostic flirting with Buddhism until his investigation, and it was this which turned things around for him. How about someone who wasn't convinced? One of my favorite atheist thinkers and debaters is Jeffrey J. Lauder. He is still an atheist, but he writes, quote, "I remember thinking to myself that if I took the time to investigate the resurrection, I could make anyone who believed it look like a fool. Or so I thought." And he confesses, quote, "I found it extremely difficult to deal with as a critic." Oxford professor Anthony Flew was perhaps the greatest defender of atheism in the last century. He also debated William Lane Craig once. At the end of his life, Flew did become a theist on the basis of the evidence. Quote, "I have followed the argument where it has led me, and it has led me to the acceptance, to accept the existence of a self-existent, immutable, immaterial, omnipotent, and omniscient being." Still, he did not accept Jesus' resurrection, but he still confessed, quote, "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It is outstandingly different in quality and quantity." And this is what has been compelling to so many people. I think the case is worth investigating, and I invite you to beliefmap.org to start that quest. As many have noticed, if God exists, then one can no longer reject the resurrection on grounds that there is no God to perform miracles. And if God raised Jesus from the dead, this figure who stands out in human history like no other, this figure who has more written about him than any other, more architecture built, worship given and song sung in his name, this figure who divides our timeline. If God really did miraculously vindicate Jesus as his chosen representative, then that should have a profound impact on your life. If you come to agree that God raised Jesus, then you have to consider what Jesus says about all humanity standing guilty before God, our coming condemnation in the afterlife, and yet the opportunity and free gift God in his love has provided through Jesus for salvation. So if this debate has done anything for you, I hope it will press you on to the next question. I just want to thank Matt again and the organizers and all of you for joining us. Really, thank you so much.
How much time I have?
8.
I might be shorter than that. I have to go to the bathroom. So here we are at the end of the debate, closing arguments, and what do we hear about? We hear about the resurrection.
3 minutes, yeah.
Which, you know. So Blake, first of all, thank you. I asked him to fill in because we'd had this scheduled and somebody else was going to do it. I know I mentioned that already, but I genuinely like Blake. We're talking about doing a podcasty type thing where we get together and talk about where we disagree and why, and hopefully we can edit it so that it's not right and then, you know, whatever. But my takeaway on this, and this is somebody who's, I'm not a philosopher either, just some dude. But Blake seems to be entrenched in Western philosophy, and I think a lot of Muslim apologists would be surprised that they're not actually producing anything because they can't. Especially I thought the original version, the Cosmological argument, came from Muslim scholars as well. we heard about Anthony Flew, who you can do a Google search for Richard Carrier and Anthony Flew, where Richard carried on a conversation with him. Basically, Anthony Flew was an atheist his entire life until he was very old and was duped by some people into believing something. Carrier got him to acknowledge this. Flew then went back and forth, but the mind of the addled ancient philosopher or the unaddled new philosopher is irrelevant. Citing all these people who might have some interesting thoughts about something or disagree with me doesn't do anything to establish that a God exists. We're back to this idea the universe is completely incapable of permitting life if you twiddle at all with the... That's not my understanding, but my understanding could be wrong. But even if that's the case, it doesn't get us to the conclusion that a God exists. Everything that we heard over and over again was improbable, 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 improbable. Hey, here's probability. Well, the thing is, probability is something that you calculate, and I don't know how you can come up with a positive probability for God when, so far as we can tell, the number of times that God has been confirmed as the correct answer to anything is 0. So I don't know where the numbers and the data are coming from. We heard Bayes' theorem mentioned at near the end of it. I had this good quote, but I didn't actually bring it with me because it basically was somebody who was likening Bayes' theorem to alchemy because it can be used to prove pretty much anything. It's been used to both demonstrate the existence of God and the non-existence of Jesus. I don't know how. I know that it's incredibly effective at actually calculating probabilities and when you have actual data to plug in, but when you seem to be just pulling out what you think is probable or improbable and multiplying improbabilities, I don't know that it gets you anywhere. The topic of the debate, does God exist? I'd love to say no. But to some people that is an assertion that you've demonstrated that there is no God. My position is that I'm not convinced that it's possible to demonstrate that a God does or doesn't exist. And it's the problem that of it being possibly impossible to demonstrate that a God exists that's where I hang my hat. Because I don't want to believe anything until it's actually been demonstrated. When we're talking about theism, the acceptance of the proposition that a God exists, theism, if we're going to go to academic dictionaries, which I'd rather we didn't do, but as long as that seems to be the trend, I'm pretty sure it's not defined as I'm leaning towards the possibility that it's probable that a God exists. It's a conclusion of an issue of fact. And when we start to talk about what that entails, what God we're actually talking about, I think we've observed here and in other places that as soon as we start digging into doctrine, as soon as we start defining God's characteristics in doctrine, when we say, oh, because the Quran doesn't say anything about a God, and it definitely doesn't say anything about a God who wants to have a relationship with you, and it definitely doesn't say about a God who wants to have a relationship with you and then came down to earth and took bodily form so he could sacrifice himself to himself to act as a loophole for rules that he created. That's not what the argument, that's not what the positions are. And so we end up in this position where believers who really believe something, who will think that, Jesus was born of a virgin and resurrected, will instead argue for, my God's kind of like that thing that maybe possibly started the universe, if that's in fact what happened. I can't do that. It's not that I don't want to believe in a God. I believed for 25 years. I was going to be a preacher. I was a Southern Baptist. I figured out I didn't actually have good reasons for what I believed. And you could make the argument that, okay, well, maybe you should check out all those doctrinal notes, all those doctrinal things that you believed, and I'd agree. But maybe you still had good reason to believe that a God exists, except the only reason I believe those that a God exists was because of the doctrinal things. What's left after you remove this idea of a God the God of Christianity, the God of Judaism, the God of Islam? When you remove all of these special characteristics to get back to the base minimal. Now, I'm not even talking about classical theism where he's necessarily omnipresent and omnibenevolent and omniscient, but just to the idea that there's a being. And then the argument becomes, oh, we live here, it's incredibly improbable that we live here, and therefore we're justified in believing that there's probably, if not actually, some other being who did all this. A being that we may or may not be able to interact with, a being that we may or may not be able to demonstrate, a being that may or may not still exist, a being that may or may not be a being. Does God exist comes with a lot of baggage. And it's not Blake's fault for not defending some of that baggage, even if I end up addressing it. But if that God with no baggage, I don't even think a God with no baggage could exist. Because when we get down to the minimal characteristics of a God, what does that tell us? I mean, if you get to the point where, oh, it must be a thinking agent. Well, we define thinking agent in terms of us. In terms of emotional beings who have needs and desires and who interact in a reality. I'm currently working on a book called If I Were God. The very first question is, if I were God, why would I create anything at all? The proposal being that God is perfect, he knows everything. What is he getting out of any of this? If he knows everything and he knows what it's like, then he knows everything that's going to happen, and he knows what it's like to be us, and he knows what it's like to be me sitting here having a conversation saying, hey, I'd be willing to have a relationship with you if you just speak up. This idea that a Damascus Road experience is good enough for Saul, and that you've got a God who, for reasons of his own, that you get to just presume are good reasons. What's the justification? There may be reasons why God doesn't want a relationship with people. There may be reasons why God decides to stay hidden. What is your justification for proclaiming that they are good reasons and not that they're not malevolent reasons? Malevolent reasons. Or that they just might be good sometimes, they might. What is your justification for thinking this God got it right? It's all presuppositions. It is all, I think there's a God, and I think that this God has these characteristics, including perfection, and anytime there's anything that appears to contradict that would appear to be an imperfection or a problem, that's a problem with our thinking and not God, because I can't be wrong about God. We're arrogant beings who think we're important, and one of the clearest demonstrations of this are the gods that we've invented. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I want to bring back up Sarah Hutter, the president of the Secular Student Alliance, UCSC.
Thank you, Dr. Grush. I'd like to just take a moment to thank the fantastic Mr. Dillahunty, Giunta, and Mr. Grush for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us tonight. I'd also like to thank UCSD and SSA National for their financial support in putting on this event. And finally, a special thanks to the superhuman Jay Bompius and Dan Pemberton for their efforts in planning, organizing,
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.